The Knights Templar, a secret brotherhood born in the throes of the Middle Ages, only to vanish after 2 centuries in existence. Of these men who left their mark on history, remains the legends that made them famous. Their white overcoats bearing the iconic Red Cross, the riches they amassed, their discipline and ferocity in battle.
These were the elite troops, the special forces of the 12th century.
After 1,000 years, mysteries still surround the myth of these soldiers of Christ.
Are they priests? Are they monks? Are they knights? What are they?
An English chronicler called them a certain new monster.
Who was behind the creation of the Order of the Temple? What was its mission? And how did the Templars become so powerful so quickly?
By the end of the 12th century, the Templars had become a substantial international organization.
Thanks to experts on the Order of the Temple, along with an investigation where the only written evidence of this period is kept, we discover the birth of a legendary brotherhood, a unique paradox of men simultaneously monk and soldier.
It's truly unheard of that there's a military code within a religious rule.
There were Christian thinkers who felt that it was an abomination to try to bring together prayer and battle.
From the arid lands of the East to the royal courts of France and England, discover the rise of the first Templars. See how they rallied the Pope, kings and people all across Europe to their cause.
People began to offer huge sums of money, large numbers of donations to the Templar Order.
The County of Champagne, Burgundy, Ile-de-France saw the birth of networks of Templar houses and commanderies every 30 to 40 kilometers.
It was completely unprecedented to become that powerful that quickly.
This is the story of the birth of the Knights Templar, a handful of men who transformed a simple brotherhood of soldiers into a religious order prepared to reign over Europe. Jerusalem. It was here, in the heart of the Middle Ages, that the first Knights Templar emerged. At the time, only a handful of knights, nearly destitute. But all are of great piety and have been trained in combat. Sworn to dedicate their lives to a new cause, the protection of the Holy Land and of the Christian pilgrims who come there to worship. To understand the origins of their existence, we must go back to the end of the 11th century. At the time, the religious world was divided. In the West, the vast majority of Europe was under the authority of the Christian Church and the Pope. Islam dominates North Africa, southern Spain, and the Near East, while the Turks threaten the Byzantine Empire and its capital, Constantinople, territory of the Orthodox Church. With Pope Urban II's call to action, the First Crusade witnessed thousands of Christians marching across Europe to reconquer the Holy Land. After 3 years of violent fighting, these crusaders reclaimed many possessions, in particular, the city of Jerusalem, where Jesus Christ was crucified and where his tomb lies.
They got to Jerusalem in the summer of 1099 and camped outside the city walls for about a month, laid siege to Jerusalem, and once they finally breached the city walls in July, there was a bloodbath. It was said that, blood was running, knee-deep. This could be a medieval exaggeration. I mean, medieval chronicles are prone to exaggerate the scale of carnage, but it was pretty bad. Muslims were slaughtered.
The First Crusade gave birth to the Crusader states, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem.
The irony was that after this 3-year epic journey with tens of thousands of people laying waste to various cities, a lot of them just went back to Europe after that.
At the dawn of the 12th century, the security of these Crusader states, threatened from all sides, rested on only a few knights of very diverse backgrounds who chose to settle there.
The challenge facing those who remain in the East after the First Crusade is to try and turn their fairly small territorial gains into permanent territories that can last in the long term. From a military perspective, they have enemies in Damascus who can raise armies of several thousand troops, and in Aleppo, a slightly larger army, and also Fatimid Egypt, which can raise about 15,000 troops. Now, given that the Crusader states, at least in their early years, can't put together more than a few hundred knights with a slightly larger contingent of infantry, that's a very serious challenge.
In Jerusalem, Christian pilgrimage is on the rise and is organized by the authorities of the Holy City, the King of Jerusalem, the Latin Patriarch at the head of the Church, and the canons of the Holy Sepulchre, which govern religious life in the city.
The Holy Sepulchre is the church that is located at the site of both the crucifixion and the burial of Christ. It's a church that attracted Christian veneration early on, and therefore it's the Holy Sepulchre which happens to be the main church of Jerusalem. And therefore it's around the Holy Sepulchre, the Patriarch and the canons, that the Church of the East is really structured.
At their side are the members of the Order of the Hospitallers of St. John of Jerusalem to help welcome pilgrims and care for the sick. But guaranteeing their safety is becoming increasingly difficult.
Pilgrims arriving in Jerusalem were under constant threat of guerrilla raids from ambushes. So all pilgrims arriving in Jerusalem could be attacked in the vicinity or near the Holy City. The outskirts of this Holy Land were by no means safe.
At the time, the Knights Templar didn't yet exist. The soldiers charged with the safety of the pilgrims were called the Milites Sancti Sepulchri, the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre.
It's a brotherhood of armed civilians who organize themselves to protect the Holy Sepulchre, to protect men and to protect property throughout the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Milites Sancti Sepulchri are neither part of the canonical order of the Holy Sepulchre nor of the Hospitaller Order of St. John of Jerusalem. It could be said that the Milites Sancti Sepulchri, who are committed to protecting pilgrims, to protecting canons, to defending, if need be, those areas which may be insecure, are in a kind of dual dependence. They are dependent on the canons, who direct their spiritual life, and they are dependent on the Hospitallers of St. John of Jerusalem, who maintain and nourish them.
Among these Milites Sancti Sepulchri, one knight will claim his independence. His goal is to form a more powerful group, a hybrid order which no one had ever dared to imagine before. Soldiers of a new kind, both religious and warrior. This knight is the founder of what will much later be known as the Order of the Temple. His identity and history are mentioned for the first time in a 12th century chronicle written by Michael the Syrian, patriarch of the Jacobite Church of Antioch.
At the beginning of the reign of Baldwin II, a Frenchman came from Rome to Jerusalem to pray. He had made a vow not to return to his own country, but to become a monk after having helped the king in the war for 3 years. Along with the 30 knights who accompanied him, he would spend the rest of his life in Jerusalem. When the king and his barons saw that the Frenchman and his knights had achieved remarkable things in battle, they advised the man to serve in the militia with his 30 knights and defend the place against bandits, rather than become a monk in the hope of saving only his own soul. Now this man, whose name was Hugh de Pin, accepted this counsel, and the 30 knights who accompanied him joined and united with him.
Hugh de Pin, born in the Champagne region around 1070, in a small village that he's named after, located 12 kilometers from the city of Troyes. He's a knight in the service of Count Hugh of Champagne. With his suzerain, Hugh de Pin will spend 3 years in the Holy Land at the beginning of the 12th century, before returning to Europe.
Hugh de Pin led a family life. He had a wife and children. And then in 1114, touched by a deep piety that must have inhabited him for a long time, he went back to the Holy Land. And this time he left with the idea that he would never come back.
Hugh de Pin is a military strategist, a defender of the Holy Land. He truly experienced what Jerusalem was, and it must have been a revelation for him. In Jerusalem, one could not be a knight like any other. One could only be a knight turned towards God, towards the service of Christ. So this idea must have germinated when he arrived in Jerusalem.
Over several years, Hugh de Pin refined his project. And in 1119, one event will change his destiny. On June the 28th, 1119, Muslims of the city of Aleppo attacked the Principality of Antioch. The intensity of the fighting will be of such violence that the event will be baptized in Latin as the Agere Sanguinis, the Battle of the Field of Blood. It is Baldwin II, the new king of Jerusalem, who will come in person to repel the invaders. This battle reinforced the sovereign's belief that the threat to the Crusader states was becoming too great.
The new king, Baldwin II, realized that he needed more military presence than he had on the ground. He needed border guards, escorts on the roads to protect the pilgrims. He needed additional forces.
It was on January the 16th, 1120, in the small city of Nablus, north of Jerusalem, that a council was to take place that would change the course of history. Assembled around the king of Jerusalem, Baldwin II and the patriarch Gontran de Piquigny, the council brought together the main clergymen and nobles of the kingdom. On that day, the two men approved the project conceived by Hugh de Pin, the formation of a new order of knights, both religious and military, dedicated entirely to the defense of the Holy Land.
The opportunity was seized by the king and the patriarch together to gamble that these knights could be operative, and the patriarch played this game, which was not a foregone conclusion, because these knights, who had gathered in the shadow of the Holy Sepulchre, were empowered. They detached themselves from the patriarch. They claimed to lead a religious life of their own, to no longer obey the directive of the Holy Sepulchre, but a master chosen from among themselves, without ceasing to be what they were, that's to say, knights and warriors.
It is King Baldwin II himself who will offer the members of this new order of chivalry a place to settle. This place is mentioned in another manuscript written by William of Tyre, known for being the first historian of the Crusades.
Over the course of the same year, some noble knights devoted themselves to the service of Christ and professed to live forever in chastity, obedience, and poverty. As they had neither church nor fixed residence, the king granted them accommodations in his palace, which was located near the temple of the Lord.
King Baldwin II made a very strong gesture by offering his palace to them in Jerusalem. Baldwin's palace actually extended south of the esplanade of the mosques, south of the Temple Mount. It extended into the area of Al-Aqsa Mosque, the former palace of King Solomon. And so Hugues de Pin and his associates somehow took on the name by association, by calling themselves the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon.
The Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Later, this name will be shortened, and the group will become one of the most significant orders in all history, the Order of the Temple. Faced with the ongoing conflicts in the Holy Land, the members of this new brotherhood must now find a way to grow.
The Templars in the 1120s, if they were going to expand, what they really needed was troops, high-quality recruits, money, and land in Western Europe that would supply them with the resources they need to carry on their vocation.
Hugh de Pin decides to return to Europe to embark on a vast recruitment and fundraising operation.
He went from country to country, France, Champagne, Flanders, England, to try to recruit and promote his project.
As an agent seeking crusaders for the King of Jerusalem, he went into all the major courts of Western Europe. People began to get curious about who he was, what his order was trying to achieve, and when they found out, they were immensely impressed and began to offer huge sums of money, large numbers of donations to the Templar order, so much so that it became very, very wealthy very, very quickly.
But Hugh de Pin and the founders of the Order of the Temple know that to bring more men and money to the Holy Land, they need to be recognized by the highest authorities of the time.
At the beginning, people were asking questions like, are they priests? Are they monks? Are they knights? What are they? Because a priest and monk is not supposed to kill, but they are fighters, they are knights.
There were Christian thinkers who considered it an abomination to want to unite prayer and combat under the same religious order. In his desire to consolidate the community, to transform it into an order, Hugues de Pin had to obtain the permission of the Roman Church and therefore of the Pope.
To obtain the Pope's approval, Hugh de Pin will use his connections in a region close to his birthplace, Burgundy. His first wife, Emmeline de Touillon, is a relative of the de Montbard family, in which we also find another man in ascendancy within the Christian Church and recognized throughout Europe, Bernard de Fontaine, who later becomes Bernard de Clairvaux, and after he is canonized, Saint Bernard.
Saint Bernard entered the order of Citeaux, and in 1115 he founded a new abbey, the Abbey of Clairvaux. He also came from chivalry, from the border of Burgundy and Champagne. So he had all the characteristics of a man of combat, with a great strength of conviction, a very great orator, eager to lead an ascetic life, a rigorous life in the order of Citeaux, which was really the figurehead of the church at the beginning of the 12th century. Saint Bernard was already in 1129 a considerable figure in the church, a sort of moral figure of the Kingdom of France, both for the clergy and for the common people.
He saw in the Knights Templar not only a chance to support the continued defence of Jerusalem, but he also wanted to reform Western European knights. For over 100 years, even before the First Crusade, one of the biggest problems facing the Catholic Church as a whole was to reform Western knighthood. Knights were seen to be troublemakers. They fought vendettas against each other, they caused trouble, they were seen to be arrogant and proud, and so Bernard of Clairvaux saw in the Knights Templar the idea of using the Templars as a role model for Western knights, say, this is how you should be, try to steer them away from their internal feuds and into what he perceived to be a more godly form of vocation.
Convinced that this new order of the Temple represented an opportunity for the Christian Church, Bernard de Clairvaux wrote a manifesto which would go down in history, entitled In Praise of the New Chivalry.
This is a new kind of militia, which fights a dual battle against flesh and blood and against evil spirits. They live without wives or children, dwell under one roof, have no property of their own. They have no fear of sin by killing an enemy, because it is for the sake of Jesus Christ that they give or receive the blow of death. They are more gentle than lambs and fiercer than lions, so much so that we do not know whether to call them monks or soldiers.
What is stated in his De Laude Nove Militia was, of course, justification of the killing of the enemy. But it wasn't just that. What is most important is the opposition that he makes between two types of chivalry. The profane chivalry, where the knights are rich or seek after richness and fight for it and love the beautiful dresses, the beautiful horses, and another kind of new chivalry. This new chivalry was impersonated by the Templar Knights that really don't care about richness, individual richness, of course, and they put their lives and all they have in support of Jerusalem, the Holy Land, and Christianity in the end.
On January the 13th, 1129, the authorities of the Christian Church, under the direction of Bernard de Clairvaux, organized the Council of Troyes, bringing together a representative of the Pope, members of the clergy, nobles, and representatives of the Order of the Temple. During this council, the very first rule of the Temple was enacted and put down in writing. Today, only 10 original copies remain in the world. Among them is this work, written in Old French and kept in the National Library of France.
The manuscript first contains the rules of the temple, which continues through page 13 and 14. Then there's a list of celebration that the Templars received from the Pope, and then the bulk of the manuscript is formed by the rules of the temple. So, for all of the Temple's legislation. This allows us to say that the manuscript belonged to the Templars. It most probably even belonged to an important house of the order, because it is a beautiful manuscript with a beautiful layout, with the watermarked letters in red and blue, so this is something important.
In the beginning of the book, we find the names of those who participated in the council. The first is perhaps the most important, Cardinal Matthew of Albano, a representative of the Pope. The following is a list of several people gathered in the cathedral of the city of Troyes, among them important religious leaders. The archbishops of Reims and Sens, the bishops of Soissons, Paris, Troyes, Auxerre, and Beauvais. 8 abbots, including, of course, Bernard de Clairvaux, noblemen such as Count Thibault of Champagne and William the Count of Nevers. At the end are named the 6 Templars present at the Council of Troyes, among them Brother Hugh de Pin, master of chivalry. On the 12 pages of manuscript, written on goatskin parchment, are all the recommendations of the Council of Troyes for members of the Order of the Temple. The rhythm of prayers when they're in battle, the care required to give their horses, or the food they're advised to eat.
You are to eat meat 3 times a week.
Everything is accounted for, down to the last detail, because unlike monks, the knights cannot fast or be lacking in sleep. They must maintain their strength to be ready for battle.
The brothers who are exhausted from the great services rendered to the order can avoid getting up for the night prayers with the permission and discharge of the master.
It's a really incredible and innovative thing, the fact that inside a religious code, there's a military part. So there's even a military code which is integrated perfectly inside of a religious order.
A little further reads that the participants in the Council of Troyes will bring the Christian Church into a new era.
We believe that this new kind of religious life was born in the Holy Land thanks to divine providence. This means that this armed knighthood can, without committing a sin, kill the enemies of the cross. For this reason, we deem that you have the right to be called Knights of the Temple.
For the first time, the Church formalizes the idea that one can kill in the name of Christ, and that its armed branch in the Holy Land has a name, the Order of the Temple.
It was the Council of Troyes which marked the birth of the Order of the Temple and which transformed the community gathered around Hugues de Pin in Jerusalem into a structure of the Latin Church.
To some people, the idea of the Knights Templar was actually quite almost heretical. One of the English chronicler by the name of Henry of Huntingdon called them a certain new monster.
The Council of Troyes, therefore, marks the beginning of a new era for the Order of the Temple, and the celebrity of these new Knights of God immediately spreads throughout Europe.
After the Council of Troyes, everything changed rapidly because this new order looked interesting to the Western world, especially, of course, to the aristocracy of the Western world that had found a way to invest their donations in something that was different from the traditional monastic orders. And so donations began to grow, began to increase. They grew constantly and quickly in a very few years, and in the 30s already, they are powerful in the East. They are starting to build the power in the West too.
They effectively became Europe's first standing army since the days of the Roman Empire. And, Rome had collapsed in the 5th century, so we're talking, the first standing army in about 600 or 700 years. So this was a really radical shift. You had a permanent military force in the East defending Christendom, defending Christian interests. Once the donations of land and money and so on came in, that's when they were able to train men up to fight. A medieval knight was the equivalent of, modern-day tank or something, just like a fully armed knight on a war horse. It was quite an awesome figure to behold, you needed to run. So these were, the elite troops, the crack troops, the special forces of the 12th century.
It was at this time the first symbols of recognition of the Templars were born, on which their legend of outstanding fighters would gradually be built.
The initial knights weren't visually, impressive to start with. They were called the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, and they were literally poor. They had nothing, just the clothes they stood up in and their swords and a few horses. So after the Council of Troyes, you get massive donations of land and money, and all of a sudden they become vastly wealthy. So the white surcoat is part of this new look. We would call it maybe a rebranding, but to a medieval person, white would symbolize purity.
This long white mantle with the red cross on it is precisely the mark of the commitment that was made, since this red cross recalls the blood shed by Christ for the redemption of humanity, and therefore the commitment of a brother of the temple, in his turn, to lay down his life and shed his blood to defend the land of Christ and the kingdom of Jerusalem.
The mission of the Knights Templar is to defend the Holy Land. They must therefore not only know how to fight, but also how to make new weapons, organize their movements, and build strongholds to defend pilgrims. And thanks to the donations, the Order of the Temple recruits.
The Templar Order essentially has 3 grades. The most famous are the Brother Knights. To be recruited as a Brother Knight, someone in Western Europe would need to be normally of aristocratic background. They would normally have been trained as a knight, so they'd already have the skills to perform the functions of a Templar knight. If you were not from an elite background, typically from a free background, perhaps from an artisan family or from a family of merchants, you would generally go into the Templar Order as a Templar sergeant. Templar sergeants could fight, but it's from their ranks the Templars would recruit their shipbuilders, their carpenters, their estate managers, people with specific trade skills. And the third type is brother priests. These are people who have been ordained as a priest and act as chaplains to the order.
When the applicant enters the temple, he commits himself to a number of things, and these obligations take place within the framework of a ceremony. And the absolutely decisive moment is when the Templar's mantle is put around the neck of the candidate. Here, he truly enters the brotherhood of the temple. And then, immediately, he swears to respect the vows of chastity, poverty, obedience, and he also swears to fight by all means in his power for the Holy Land. We sometimes refer to this as the 4th vow, and it's something quite essential because a Templar of any kind, knight, sergeant, or chaplain, whether in the West or in the East, ideally competes in the defense of the Holy Land. It's an entry into brotherhood, an entry into an order, hence the importance of the mantle, hence the importance of the sword, and the importance of the oath.
Gradually, Templar houses called commanderies were created in Western Europe. The brothers lived there by scrupulously respecting the guidelines of the temple by pursuing only one mission: to prepare to fight in the East and to grow the wealth of the order to finance the Holy War.
A commandery is a large building with a residence, with common buildings, a granary to store crops, and above all, a chapel. It is in the commandery that the chaplain goes to officiate, where he will do the canonical services for all the brothers. The county of Champagne, Burgundy, Provence, Auvergne, Ile-de-France saw the birth of networks of Templar houses and commanderies every 30 to 40 kilometers. So it was a network that formed fairly quickly during the 12th century. These commanderies and these Templar houses are also used to recruit locally. Their establishment, their impact, their daily relationship with the populations also serve to feed this recruitment.
In 1136, Hugh de Pin, the first Grand Master Templar, dies after returning to fight in the East. He is replaced at the head of the order by Robert de Caen, who brilliantly organizes the operation and management of the commanderies, which continue to develop thanks to donations. 10 years after the Council of Troyes, events are accelerating. On March the 29th, 1139, Pope Innocent II writes a papal bull which will go down in history. A document which bears his seal and is baptized Omne Datum Optimum, the 3 Latin words with which it begins.
Every good grace and every perfect gift descends from above, from the Father of light, with whom there is no change or shade of variation. We exhort you to fight the enemies of the cross with ardor, and as reward, we allow you to keep for yourselves all the spoils that you have seized, without anyone having the right to claim from you a share of them. And we declare that the Order of the Temple, with all its possessions acquired by the bounty of the popes, the kings, and the princes, remains under the protection and guardianship of the Holy See.
According to this text, not only can the Templars preserve the wealth accumulated during battles against Muslims in the Holy Land, but they place themselves under the authority of one person, the Pope himself.
No one can force you to pay tithes, but we confirm to you the possession and enjoyment of the tithes given to you with the consent of the bishops, so that you may have the fullness of salvation and care for your souls. For the practice of the divine offices and the giving of the ecclesiastical sacraments, you may admit clerics and priests. We grant you the power to build chapels in all the places attached to the temple, so that you and your relatives may attend services and be buried there. For it is bad for your morals if the brothers of the temple, on their way to church, should mingle with crowds of sinners and those who keep company with women.
The Order of the Temple will no longer pay tax to the Church. Will have the right to collect tax without going through the bishops, train its own priests, build its own churches, and anyone who questions this protection of the Pope will be excommunicated.
The Templars were not subject to the authority of any other churchman, so no archbishops, no bishops, except for the Pope himself. This gave the order a great deal of freedom of movement, at least within the church hierarchy, but it also stirred up resentment among the archbishops and the bishops and the other members of the church who felt the order had too much independence and wasn't responsive to their leadership.
Over the following years, successive popes will further strengthen the privileges given to the Templars. In 1144, the faithful were expressly asked to contribute to the mission of the Knights Templar, and it was stipulated that the Pope would grant his forgiveness to the benefactors of the Order of the Temple.
He who has provided them with the goods God has entrusted to them, and who has established a bond with such a holy brotherhood and allowed them to make a profit each year, will receive a reduction of 1/7 on the penances he has incurred.
There were huge tracts of land were given to them by kings all over Europe, but even, small grants of land like, estates, farms, water mills, things like that. If somebody wanted to donate to the order, they would accept everything. No donation was too large or too small, because it was all, with the greater good of keeping the Christian kingdom in the East going. It was very good for a Christian to donate to an order like the Templars, because it's good for your soul, it was good for your afterlife, and minimise your time in purgatory, and would ensure that you went to the right place when the time came.
In 1145, a new papal bull gave the Knights Templar the right to bury their brothers in their own cemeteries and to travel freely throughout Europe.
So from 1129 to 1146, we could compare them to, like a corporation or something, or a business going from a small start-up to being multinational in 17 years. I mean, even today, that length of time is quite impressive. But in the Middle Ages, it was completely unprecedented for a small group of people to become that powerful that quickly. It had never happened before.
But while the Templar enterprise is developing quickly in the West, in the East, the situation in the Crusader states has deteriorated. Defeated in Damascus in 1129, in Bahrain in 1137, in Tequa in 1139, and especially in Edessa in 1144, where it's said that 30,000 Christians were massacred. The failures of the Crusaders mount one after another.
These were not the setbacks of the Templars. These were the setbacks of the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which were starting to integrate within it perhaps a few dozen Templars. But these setbacks were bitter. The Templars still lacked influence within the army, and the qualities of order and discipline that we know of them were not really imposed.
In the face of these defeats and the threat to Christians in the East, Pope Eugene III decided to act. With the papal bull Quantum Predecessoris, he called for a new crusade. Bernard de Clairvaux himself is in charge of mobilizing the population. On March the 31st, 1146, at Vézelay in Burgundy, he preached the journey to the Holy Land by promising to those who would take up the cross the absolution of all sins. Among the many sovereigns from all over Europe who joined the Second Crusade was Louis VII, King of France, and his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine. And to help in their endeavor, they turned to those with sufficient means: the Knights Templar.
In 1147, Louis VII requested funding from the Order of the Temple, and he entrusted them for the first time with his treasure. So they already have resources that can help the sovereign with his crusade, arming ships, etc. These are the Templars who served as scouts, protectors, guides along the road. And the crusade route is very challenging for Louis VII. They suffered very harsh Turkish attacks, and it was the Knights of the Temple, led by their Marshal Evar de Bar, who will become Grand Master, who saved the royal army.
Louis VII is not the only one to embark on the Second Crusade. Conrad III, King of Germany, also made his way to the Holy Land with nearly 20,000 men at his side. But from the first months of combat, the armies of the two kings suffered great setbacks against the Muslims. Mount Cadmos, Doriley, Inab. Defeats follow one after another, and the deaths pile up. Financing these losing battles is beginning to cost the two kings dearly. So to find the necessary money, Louis VII needs help. He will turn once again to his new allies, the Knights Templar.
When the crusade gets into difficulty, In 1148, Louis turns to the master of the temple and says, "Can you help us?" So the Templars, the Grand Master goes off in his ship and gets the money from a Templar stronghold. This is like the first time we can see the Templars acting effectively as bankers, supporting European kings. They're not just supporting the interests of the church and fighting for Christ and defending souls, but they are now, by the time of the Second Crusade, also financially very powerful and literally funding the crusade.
Despite financial assistance from the Knights Templar, the troops of the King of France and the King of Germany were unable to recover any territory from their enemies. After 3 years of fighting, the two sovereigns give up. A crusade for nothing, which will nevertheless benefit the Order of the Temple.
The Second Crusade was a total failure. It ended with nothing at all. Mostly because the presence of Conrad III and the King of France revealed to be a problem. They disagreed on almost everything. They made all the possible wrong choices, like taking the siege of Damascus, who ended up badly for the King of France with a lot of money spent. He had to ask for money to the Templars in order to go back to France. The defeat of the Second Crusade probably helped the Templars. They had lended money to the king. They were the forces that truly ended well in the local situation.
The Knights Templar had shown, both by loaning money to the King of France and also reorganising his army at one stage, they had shown how effective that they could be, and this would not be forgotten by the Kings of France in the future.
The Second Crusade will be a resounding military failure, and Louis VII returns to France in 1149, greatly weakened financially and diplomatically. However, his ordeal contributes to the growth of the legend of the Knights Templar.
He came back from the Holy Land with a lofty idea of what the Knights of the Temple were like. For him, this is an order that shines over the whole surface of the earth and which has no equivalent in his mind. And he will not cease to give them income and money from his tax revenues. He cedes to them the Villa Savigny, which will become the great commandery of Savigny-le-Temple. So this is a king who shows the same fascination of the sovereigns for the beginnings of the Order of the Temple, since it is less than 30 years after its creation, and the King of France is truly an unconditional supporter of the Knights of the Temple.
During the Second Crusade, the Templars were able to supply their own contingent to go on crusade. Whilst continuing their work in the Crusade estates, they were also able to afford a series of massive loans to the King of France to support the King of France's crusade to the Holy Land. By the end of the 12th century, the Templars had become a substantial international organisation. We don't know precisely how many members they had, but it seems likely that they would have had about 600 fighting brother knights in the Crusade estates, but then with a much larger substantial contingent of infantry and other employees and followers. In Western Europe, they would have had an equally, possibly even larger number of brother knights, brother sergeants, and other personnel, all there to facilitate the supply of resources to the Holy Land.
The Templars developed this reputation for avarice, but I think what was really going on was they were just very good businessmen.
At the beginning of the second half of the 12th century, the Order of the Temple will become more and more powerful. Supported by popes and kings, the Order accumulates considerable wealth, building commanderies in the west and castles in the east. Its ranks will not cease to grow. The reign of these new Knights of Christ was only beginning.